Welcome along to our Royal Scottish Forestry Society online talk. Thank you very much to everybody who's here tonight, and especially to those who are returning. We've got a great session in store to begin our year's programme today. But I'll just do a little look ahead to some future events before I begin to introduce Ben. So on Monday, the 2nd of February, as part of our speaker series, we've got Dr. Lawrence Shaw who'll be joining us. And his talk is titled Rooted in History. And it's all about the archaeological stories that can be found in our forests. And that event is on the RSFS website already and open for booking. And then after Lawrence, we've got two more talks to finish the series. They're not yet advertised, but they should be soon. But if you want to make a note in your diary, on the 16th of February, we've got Professor Laurie Daniels from UBC in Canada, and she'll be talking about the Canadian approach to wildfires and the need for coexistence with wildfires. And to round off our series, on Monday, the 2nd of March, we're going to welcome Max Hislop from TreeLink Stirling, who's going to be talking about his Forest for a Community project. But tonight, let's do some introductions and introduce you to Ben. So, such an interesting topic tonight. We're going to be exploring the crossover between horticulture and silviculture. And our speaker, Ben, is a consultant, practitioner, author, and communicator, and has recently co-authored the excellent book Silvohorticulture, a grower's guide for incorporating trees into crops. And the book sets out what a beneficial integrationist can be for optimizing yield, improving soil, managing pests and water, increasing biodiversity, and reducing costs. I'm a complete novice to this area, but I really enjoyed Ben's book and learned so much about the area. And I'm sure Ben will talk about his discoveries as a keen silvohorticulturalist tonight, as well as share his unbridled enthusiasm for wood chippings, I believe, Ben. I'm sure that's going to make an appearance. So I'll hand over to Ben and let him take it from here.
Thank you very much, and apologies for keeping you waiting. Desperately juggling my children's dinner and the rest of life, so very sorry. Right, can you see? I'm not started yet. Can you see that?
Yep, that's coming through, Ben. We
Is
can
that
see
coming
that.
through? Great. I can't see you at all now, so if there are any questions, do feel free to interrupt. But Kat, I might need you just to shout.
I can
Um,
certainly do that. I'll keep an eye on the chat as well, Ben.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So yes, as Kat said, I have a background in horticulture. I was a commercial vegetable grower for a number of years, and then accidentally joined the Soil Association when I was moving back down to the West Country, which is where I'm from. And nearly 20 years later, I'm still there. But I do other things alongside it. I work part-time for the Soil Association. I manage agroforestry project on Helen Browning's 1,500-acre farm and do a little bit of consultancy, as Kat said, and written a few books. So that's me. So yeah, I think I'd always had some trees as part of my horticultural enterprises, but I'd never really understood them, I think, beyond the fact that I picked the fruit from them. And, so I could look after them as a crop, but I didn't really understand how they fitted into the wider system. And over the last probably 15 years or so, I've become much more interested in agroforestry and in how trees can integrate into the farming landscape. And well, you will know as well as I do the split that sort of happened really between forestry and farming, as both of them have become more efficient and industrialized potentially. The worlds are separated, and we have forestry that happens over here, and we have farming that happens over here, and the sort of the bit in the middle gets forgotten. And certainly farmers have forgotten, as I did, I think, how trees used to be a part of the farm and a part of the farming enterprise. And agroforestry really, I mean, it's not a perfect term, and it's one that causes probably some confusion, and even amongst agroforesters, there's debate about what it means. But it's the idea really is that you're deliberately managing your trees as part of your farm rather than as something separate. And so it could be as one tree in a field, it could be a hedge, it could be a shelter belt, a potentially farm woodland that you let livestock into occasionally. or sort of, as this picture on the left shows, a sort of alleys of trees, which is what some people now associate with agroforestry. And I'll go in more detail later on into all of the benefits of agroforestry. And Kat's asked me to sort of focus it around horticulture. I've got a couple of slides on livestock, but the benefits in a way are the same. It's about improving your soil. It's about benefiting from shade and shelter. It's about biodiversity. It's about water management. So all of these things that trees can do as part of the farm and part of the landscape. And obviously they can also have potentially, from a farmer's point of view, they can have a negative impact if you get it wrong. So when you're designing agroforestry systems, you do sort of need to know, and I would say particularly in crop systems where the potential competition between the trees and the crop happens, understanding how that's going to happen and designing so that it works is really important. So sort of I mentioned the different ways that you could potentially have trees. Here's just a small snapshot of a few examples. We've got, I don't know if you can see my little mouse hovering. You've got on the top left a rather sad and destroyed looking hedge that is not probably delivering anything much to the farm compared to something just to its right, where if you let it grow up and out a bit, suddenly you're getting not only that incredible biodiversity, but also the shade and shelter, and certainly some control of water, which might mean that you don't lose your soil, for instance, over the winter and heavy rain. And then various animal situations. So the one on the right is effectively a woodland that stock go into occasionally. And increasingly, I think farmers are starting to understand that those bits of farm woodland that they used to just ignore and leave on the corner could be a useful addition to their farm. I was actually out with someone just at the weekend, and they've got quite a few areas like this. They've got shelter belts along a road, and rather than fencing the stock out of the woodland, which is what they have typically done, they're going to fence on the roadside, but then control the access with electric fencing. So they won't allow the stock access all the time to the trees, but they'll let them in occasionally. And certainly in a summer like the summer we've just had, that need for shade is really vital in keeping animals happy and healthy and productive. And then we've got pigs. Obviously, I love pigs. It's quite hard, pigs and woodland. They can do a lot of damage very quickly. So integrating trees with pigs is hard, I would say. You need a very small number of pigs and a large number of trees. But there might still be ways, even in outdoor pig systems, of providing some areas of tree cover, even if the pigs aren't going right up next to it. And then the bottom middle is the quickest win in a way for trees, which is with poultry. And that's David Brass, who's a big poultry producer in Cumbria. And he supplies McDonald's, and he did a big trial with I think 36 of his flocks. He put trees in and 36 he didn't. And he reckoned the payback period for the investment of the trees was 8 months, which is really remarkable. And there's a really good case study on him on the Woodland Trust website if you're interested. So lots of different ways of doing it. These are some more horticultural or cropped type systems. So the one on the top left is a double row of hazel that they coppice alternate years, so that they've always got some shade and shelter, and they've done horticultural and arable crops in between. It's quite a narrow system, that, and they would say that if they knew now what they knew when they put it in 30 years ago, they would have done it wider, I think. The top middle one is a globe artichoke and apple system. Then the one at the bottom left is a mixed horticultural system with heritage apples. And then the one on the right is quite interesting. It's protected cropping, obviously, as you can see, with cherries and nectarines, and a range of salad crops. And it's in West Wales, where growing that type of fruit outside would be impossible. And he's getting really good price in the local market for his nectarines and apricots and things. So yes, it's interesting how you can use it to widen the amount of produce that you have. So that's certainly one of the reasons I think growers and smaller growers that are selling direct are interested in it. So if we get on in a bit more detail, as I say, because a lot of growers will have grown trees, it's in some ways it's quite easy for horticulturalists to think about integrating trees into their system. But as soon as you start to do it, you do run into certainly the challenges of competition and also management, because almost all farms now rely on machinery. And so making sure that you design a system that still works for your kit. So for instance, this system, which is Andy Dibbon. So Andy is the guy that I co-wrote the book with. This is his farm in Gloucestershire. And he designed the widths of his between the apples to be the same width as his fleece, his crop covers, so that he could just roll them down within. So he thought quite carefully about the system he was using and the kit that he needed and how that was going to work. So those are some of the considerations, as well as how the trees and the crops are going to interact. So yes, I mentioned some of these benefits already. Shade and shelter, water regulation, soil health and fertility, biodiversity, those are the main drivers. There's also obviously things like carbon sequestration that you might be interested as well. I love finding quotes to prove that we're not actually doing anything new and everybody's thought of everything beforehand. So this is a quote from 1952. I don't know if any of you recognize it, but it's from John Steinbeck's East of Eden. So they were planting eucalyptuses there to try and prevent the dust bowl, which obviously failed. They didn't plant enough of them, presumably. But they understood the concept, at least. So this is, yeah, nothing new. We're just rediscovering it, I think. So wind is obviously a big challenge. This is not an out of focus picture. This is topsoil being blown away over in the east of England. Very light, sandy soil. And Stephen Briggs, who is one of the pioneering agroforestry farmers, his main driver for getting trees onto his arable farm was just to hold on to his soil. He could see every year it was blowing away off into the sea eventually, and he wanted to keep it on. So slowing down the wind is a vital component, I would say. And there's some interesting work by John Davis and others looking at these optimum shelter belts. So there's obviously, I'm sure a lot of you know the principles of the shelter belt, but he's done quite a bit of work looking at how best to design them with that sort of tortoise-like shape, which helps to sort of keep the fastest, coldest air moving higher and keeping the warmer, slower air through your crops. So yeah, again, that idea that you don't want a solid break that just causes the turbulence. You want to slow it down gradually and keep that distance as long as you can. And typically, I would say in horticultural systems, we don't usually want big trees because we tend to be working on smaller areas, and big trees cast big shade and will compete more for moisture and nutrients. So whereas in an arable system, or certainly in livestock systems, you might well want really big, long-lived trees. Typically in horticultural systems, we're looking at fruit and nut trees and coppiced trees. And one of the beauties of the coppicing system is you can adjust the height of your windbreak every year and grow the crops in between it that suit really well that height, if you see what I mean. So there are some crops that, so for instance, once your fertility crop is established, it can be as windy as it like, it doesn't really matter. So in this example, sort of over on the right, sort of the end of year 5, you would sow your fertility crop while you've got the protection, because while it's actually establishing, it doesn't want to be too windy. But once it's germinated and started to grow, then you can coppice. You've got 1 year where the whole site is very exposed, but that's fine because you've got your fertility crop, and then gradually you can build up a sort of slightly higher wind barrier, but also that would be giving increasing shade as well. So then you need to think about sort of which are the crops that can cope with shade or not cope with shade. And it can get even more complicated looking at what does well near the tree and what does well in the middle of the alley. And these are the two, I guess, the two guiding principles for when you're designing the alleys is actually how you don't want to be too you don't want to be too narrow or you'll get too much shade. And you don't want to be too wide or you won't get enough wind protection. So that balance between somewhere between twice the height of the tree, but also potentially not more than 10, although John Davis reckons with the right design, you can get maybe 20 or 25 times the height of the tree, but 10 to be sure. So that is quite a good basic principle in terms of designing those alleys, depending on how high. And obviously, it might be how high it is at that maximum year 5. But it's all flexible, of course. So yes, this is the system from Wakelands, where as you can see, they're sort of doing it in alternate years. So rather than that 5-year cycle, they're cropping every row of trees every year. They're coppicing half of it. So they won't have massive windbreaks, but they will always have some protection. And that's quite a nice way of doing it. And you could potentially have 3 rows and do it every 3 years, for instance. So that's the wind. Then sunlight. Plants obviously need sunlight to grow, but if you don't get enough, then they end up all weak and spindly, and you get this imbalance between the foliage and the roots. And of course, it also, they don't yield as well, and they're more vulnerable to pests. But equally too much, and we certainly saw this last year at times, you get scorched leaves and fruit, wilting, irregular transpiration, and lower yields as well. And plants will be suffering before we see them suffering. And so, in a way, understanding what the plant needs in advance is really useful. And whereas historically in the UK, we wouldn't have been worried about too much sunlight or too much heat, increasingly that is a challenge. And I certainly last year we had black currants that were cooking in the sun, and when I came to pick them, I couldn't sell them because they were cooked. And actually, they would have loved a bit of semi-shade for some of it. And I've got a slide, I think, in a minute, looking at sort of what the different ones need. So understanding how much light your crops need and when they need it is really important. So there's a few principles again. First of all, different crops need different light levels. Different trees cast different levels of shade. So that's both because of their habits. So some trees obviously are very spreading and some are more upright, but also some have quite dense foliage and some have lighter foliage. So for instance, we've got apricots and almonds that we're growing at Helen's farm, and we're trying to grow soft fruit in between them. And the apricots are really spreading and have really dense, thick foliage, and almost nothing grows underneath them. The poor gooseberries are desperately trying to produce something and mostly not. Whereas the almonds are quite upright and they've got a much more sort of feathery type foliage, and quite a lot of the light gets through. And the crops, I've got raspberries underneath them that are doing quite well. So in hindsight, I wouldn't try and grow anything probably underneath apricots, but almonds works well. So that sort of experience has been interesting for me, where I would have just assumed, yeah, well, of course you can grow stuff in between trees. And the other bit to think about is that seasonal change. So obviously trees come in and out of leaf, and they do that at different times. And some things are fine. Some things even prefer shade. So lettuces in this example do really well. They don't need a lot of sun, and would be much happier. Certainly in the hot summer, they'd be much happier with quite a shady spot. And other things like garlic, you could plant right up to the tree, because most of the time they're growing, the tree won't be in leaf. And then by the time it comes into leaf, you're starting to harvest it, or certainly it's finished that main bit of its growing. So yeah, this is the. I think we've made an assumption. I certainly probably made an assumption in the past that, yeah, crops need to be out in the field in full sun. That's what they like. As a rule, the leafy crops probably only need 2, 3, maybe 4 hours of sunlight a day. Full sun, that is. The sort of the stemmy stuff and the roots probably need more like 4 or 5. And then the fruit, so things like tomatoes and squashes, they will need much more sun. So again, you can start to see, well, if I've got quite a shady year where the trees have got bigger, or planting closer to the trees, then putting those crops that like the shade is going to be part of your design. And yeah, so here's an example of how you might do that, and thinking about those different layers. You can build different heights of trees in. So you might, with a bigger system, you might well have a big tree and then some smaller trees next to it, and then your bushes. And this builds on some of the permaculture principles. I don't call myself a permaculturalist, but actually some of the agroforestry systems, and particularly where you start looking at these multi-layered systems in horticultural operations, it does get quite close to the permaculture design, where you've got your perennial crops like rhubarb and daffodils, and then your annuals in the middle. But it's infinitely flexible. So yes, we've talked about this a little bit, and it's certainly about the shape and the density of the leaf. We've talked a little bit about how you can pollard then to adapt the size of the tree for your needs, and you can, depending on the species, you could be coppicing it. If it's a vigorous willow, you could potentially be coppicing it every year, or hazel you might do every 5 years. Something slower growing you might do less often. And the other option is on the right. You can train to espaliers or even stepovers. I saw a system in Italy where a whole field of fava beans had been planted, and it was just divided across the hill by rows of stepover apples every sort of 30 meters or so. So it wasn't really giving a huge amount of benefit, I would say, in terms of shade and shelter, but it did increase diversity into the crop, and allowed them to get an apple crop. And obviously you can train that to almost whatever height you want to suit a smaller, more intensive system. And then the other interesting thing, Andy got very involved in working out these calculations, was not just the fact that sort of the shade, but also how long that shade is, how deep that shade is. So obviously in the summer it's shorter, but it's darker, because of the leaf on the tree, whereas in winter those shadows actually can be really long, but because the leaves mostly have fallen off, then it will be a less dark shadow. But again, sort of thinking about the direction of your trees and your rows and how that's going to work when you're designing it. And then in terms of that orientation, typically to get the maximum benefit from the sunlight, they say you should plant north to south. And that's because effectively you get this full sun and partial sun all through the year. Whereas typically if you have an east to west, one side will get all of the sun and the other will get none of it. But of course, most fields don't necessarily make it easy to plant north to south. It might be on a slope, or it might be a long thin field, or the gate might be in the wrong place. So you sort of have to take some of it with a pinch of salt. And even if you had to plant east to west, you could still potentially adapt some of your crops and plant the ones that needed to be on the south side, for instance. And again, if you plant a small tree, then it doesn't have that much impact. But equally, you're not getting so much of the benefit, certainly in terms of the shade and shelter. And then the final bit really is the biodiversity, and every bit of the tree and every bit of the tree row will give you biodiversity. So the canopy has all the birds and insects and what have you. The other bit I've started to get really interested in is this deadwood bit. I didn't, again, until probably about 2 or 3 years ago. Obviously, I knew deadwood was good, but I hadn't really thought about how much we've removed from our landscapes. And typically, and I suspect foresters are similar, but certainly farmers, they like to tidy up. We like to be tidy, and we like to, if we trim something, we like to make sure we get rid of it and we burn it, or we, chip it up and move it away, and nothing's left. And so I think we need to work quite hard as farmers to build that back in and to consciously provide dead wood of all sizes. The Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust have just started a new project called the Deadwood Society, which I quite like. So they're using it as a lens to sort of support farmers to bring more trees, but particularly more deadwood back into the system. But certainly as a grower, I see biodiversity not just as something that's nice to have, but it's a key part of my system to make it work. It's how I get things pollinated. It's providing predators. So all of that is, without that, my system doesn't work, because we're organic. We don't want to spray. And if you're not spraying, then you have to have those natural friends to make the system work. And every bit of the tree, the flower, the twigs, the leaf, the root, they all provide some form of habitat for something. I was amazed that probably 6 months or so after we planted the first field of trees at Helen's, and they were barely more than sticks in the ground, but suddenly they were alive with spiders and insects crawling all over them. And there might have been one or two pests in them, I don't know, but certainly they didn't suffer. And looking now, we rarely get a pest problem there other than birds, and that's a slightly different challenge. And this is our big deadwood pile at Helen. So we pollarded some big willows along the brook that's just behind this picture. And rather than burn them or get rid of them, we just left them in a huge pile. And the cattle love them. They come and rub up against them. And I'm sure there's all kinds of amazing stuff living in the center of it. And it's just a lovely place to sit occasionally on a big pile of wood. And this is Alan Schofield, who we dedicated the book to. He's a long-standing grower up in Lancashire, and the trees you can see are a 5-year pollarded alder rotation, which he inherited but then grew with for 30 years. And he was one of our inspirations in terms of understanding particularly these really complicated rotations. He after 30 years, he had a really, really good understanding of exactly where he could plant which crops and how they would thrive. What he did is he took the bigger stuff for firewood, but all of the other stuff, the brash and the smaller stuff, he left along the alley. So he was really building up that fertility and fungal life, which would have worked its way back into the alleys over time. So again, as foresters, you will understand this far better than I did until I started researching. I had this idea that most tree roots look like something on the left, and then realised that actually most of them look like something on the right, which obviously has quite big implications when you are trying to plant things next to them and grow crops next to them. Again, it's one of the reasons why I tend to recommend less vigorous plants and smaller plants. And one of the things that I think we've all started realizing, those of us that have been trying to integrate some of this is that the prunus species particularly are really challenging. They sucker a lot and compete quite a lot with crops, but of course a lot of the fruit varieties are prunus, so there's a bit of a challenge there. I think there's opportunities to manage it through root pruning and keeping the trees a bit smaller, but it is definitely something that has to be managed. And even in the system we've got at Helland, which isn't annual crops, some of the soft fruit that we're growing in between, I think, is definitely suffering a little bit from some of that competition and suckering. So yeah, so that idea, if you, in theory, and there is research to back this up, in theory, if you keep pruning the tree from when it's young, it does obviously not something you want to do to a mature tree, but if you root prune constantly where as it grows, you force the roots down, and they actually end up growing under the crop. So similar sort of root structure, but a foot or two down, depending on your soil structure, leaving potentially enough soil on top for the crop to survive and thrive. So if you can get that right and it's not too vigorous a tree, you can adapt your system by doing that root pruning early on. But equally, the species selection and the rootstock selection is also important. And so yeah, the phasing, really, this is the bit that I talked about where you're effectively managing a really complex, I don't know, 4 or 5D rotation. So typically I looked at, when I was a grower, I looked at my rotations as flat, from above, and I would say, right, that's where I'm putting the brassicas this year, and they move on to that next year and on to that next year. And it was all very 2D and flat, and although it was moving with time, it was quite simple. Whereas once you start to integrate trees into it, it gets much more complicated, and you've got all of the things we talked about with the seasonal light changing, and the leaves coming in and out on the tree. So it gets really interesting, but also quite challenging to get that design to work. And will depend obviously on things like slope and soil and what crops you're growing and what trees you want. And indeed the seasonal bit that we talked about, so building that in, and again, it will depend on what crops, but if you're growing quite a lot of winter crops, you can probably take advantage of that higher light level than you would have in the summer. And one of the big things for Andy, certainly, when he talks about the benefits of trees, is protecting them from the really violent winds and from the physical damage that crops can suffer, and particularly leafy crops. And actually in the winter, a bare deciduous tree is quite useful for slowing down the wind a little bit and just protecting those plants, because actually violent winter winds can destroy some of those leafy crops, particularly things like kale. So so that's the annual phasing. So it might be, and the other bit I haven't really talked about, but actually quite often, and again historically, orchards often would have crops grown in between them while they were establishing. So the agroforestry phase was actually a temporary phase until the orchard was established. And that picture on the left, I think, shows that, where effectively that smallest arrow you've got is the size of the tree at planting, which means you've got all of that space to the edge of the photo where you could grow crops, and then after 3 years it's reduced, and then by the time it's full, you really wouldn't want to be growing much under there at all, as opposed to the managed coppiced system, which changes. So that is all my slides, but I'm very happy to answer lots of questions, and you can find me. I've got a website where you can buy the books, but also do feel free to email me. That's actually not showing, is it? But it's .org at the end if you want to, if you've got any questions afterwards. So I will stop sharing. And I didn't talk very much about woodchip, actually, Kat, but I can talk lots about woodchip as well.
Yeah, well, I might ask you a question about woodchip in a second, Ben, but Thank you so much for that talk. It was fascinating to hear about all the variables that go into planning a good system. And we'll just throw open now to questions. So if anyone in the audience has a question they'd like to ask, you can either type it in the chat box or you can just unmute your microphone and speak.
I've also spotted Tom, one of my ex-colleagues, on the call, so he's got lots of knowledge too.
I'm sure he'll have a question. A question from Sandy to start us with. Sandy, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. That was really interesting presentation. It was quite stark, the two pictures you had of the hedges. One was like completely shorn and the other one was left to grow. And you were saying, you know, the completely shorn one was pretty much useless. You might as well not have it. Whereas the one that was left to have a bit more space was a lot more useful from lots of different perspectives. I was interested to, and I'm sure there will be some agri-environment schemes that detail minimum widths and stuff like that somewhere. But if you're not in one of those, what would the minimum width do you think you would need to have for a meaningful hedgerow that would make a difference? What kind of space would it take in a field?
Well, I mean, if you talk to environmentalists, they basically say the taller the better and the wider the better. I mean, obviously the trouble is if you keep leaving it and keep leaving it, you just end up with a row of trees. So you do have to manage it. And one of the things, Organic Research Centre actually have done quite a lot of good work looking at rotationally coppicing or laying hedgerows. So, I mean, I would say if you want to manage it and keep it relatively small, I would say at least 4 meters tall, really, and probably 3 or 4 meters wide to be useful. But actually coppicing it on something like a 10 or a 15-year cycle is also really useful. Well, and Tom, actually, who's on the call, he ran a project called the Whole Farm Tree Plan, where, you know, part of that project was looking at how you assess and visualize the benefits of that increased height and width, for instance, of hedges. And you can sort of almost, you know, for every, and particularly if you think about that sort of seasonal shade at different times of year, you know, an extra meter on your hedge potentially is an extra 5 meters of shade at certain times of year, or, you know, 15 meters of shelter in the winter. So it's almost thinking of it like that, and how far do you want those benefits to go? And if you've got livestock, if you know that first hedge, even assuming that, you know, once it's greened up and isn't looking quite so horrific. I mean, I did pick a particularly cruel example, but even if you were saying, well, I'm going to have a 2 meter high hedge and a 1 meter wide hedge, that will still obviously provide some shade and shelter. But what will happen is all the livestock will crowd into that little kind of 1 or 2 meters of shade that it gets. And so they'll end up probably too close to each other, which can cause health problems. They'll probably damage the soil because they're all trampling right up close to the hedge because they have to get into the shade. Whereas if it was, you know, 4 meters or even, let's say, 7 meters tall, and you had 7 meters or 10 meters of shade, then actually there's plenty of room for all of them. They can space out, they can, you know, they can be chilled, but even the weak ones will get some shade. And so some of that benefit is looking, well, how much hedge do you have? And I do understand, you know, a lot of farmers want their hedges to look tidy and they don't want them to look like that second picture. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing. But I think if we can move away from the really bad, you know, I say bad, you know, the really tight, small hedge. And I think mostly it's because farmers don't see any benefit. They just see it as something that has to be managed. And the quickest and easiest way is to keep it small, run up it. You know, they don't think it's benefiting the rest of their farming enterprise. So they actually want to minimize how much space it takes up. So I think that's the challenge. But yeah, in answer to your question, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, which I haven't really answered. But effectively, I would say as tall as you can make it while still making it manageable, if that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask Ben? Ben, I've got one whilst people are thinking. When you showed the East of Eden quote, you were talking about people were kind of rediscovering the silvohorticulture sector, and I was just wondering if you were conscious of an increase in interest lately, and if so, what you put that to, and almost what's your vision of where it might go in the future?
So whether I've seen a change in the last year or two, I don't know, but I've certainly seen a massive change since I started working on it. So 15 years ago, mostly, I would be met with what? Agri what? And sort of having to start, from first principles really and explaining it. And a few people got it, but most people were just like, oh no, I don't think I need more trees, thank you. And I think that conversation has definitely changed. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think partly it's just become more understood. It's been talked about, partly because of the work that we've done, that Wood and Trust have done, the farmers like Stephen Briggs and, the Farm Woodland Forum. So there's a number of organisations that have been promoting it, and that's helped. I think the government change in policy, and while it has varied from nation to nation and time to time. So for a while, Scotland had the most supportive policy framework. They've actually slipped a bit now, and at the moment, assuming that the SFI reopens properly, England's got quite a good one, but we're hopeful about the new Welsh one. So, so depending on where you are, it is now mostly part of farming support and part of the farming discussion. So it's not seen as, oh, trees are forestry and that's all they are. There's an element of, oh, okay, so there's support for doing some tree stuff in farming. That's interesting. And then the big one, which I'd say is probably in the last 2 or 3 years has really focused minds, and particularly I think livestock farmers, is climate change and the realities of having to deal with these extremes of weather that we're getting. And I would say I've had, certainly more than 5 farmers have gone, oh my God, last year was so hot. I really understand now that I need shade, because I just, I saw my stock suffering. So that, I think that's really sharpened the mind. I think livestock farmers are likely to be quicker to adopt it, and I think that's partly because it's so much easier to implement it in livestock systems. It's almost a no-brainer, and it's almost impossible to get it wrong. I mean, not quite, but pretty much any tree will give you some shade and shelter, and the right tree will also give you browse. Whereas it's more complicated in cropping systems, and the land is more valuable, and the risk is higher. So it's a bigger conversation. So I'd say there's a relatively small number of practitioners still in the cropping system. But yeah, it's certainly, I mean, what I would love is that it's just normalized as a farming practice. So that project that I mentioned that Tom and I worked on, the whole farm tree plan, it's like it's a whole farm and it's trees, and it's not some weird thing that doesn't have any impact. It's like every farming decision that you make, how about trees? And it might not be that trees are right, but that you go, oh, I want to I need some new fencing. Oh, well, maybe I could grow my own fence posts. I need to give the cows a bit of protection. Well, rather than build a barn, could I put them in a woodland instead? So, almost everything you do on a farm, a tree might help. And so it's what I would love is for basically all farmers, rather than, and unfortunately, this and it's not helped by some of the rewilding stuff and some of the fact that tenants are being kicked off farms for environmental payments. So it is seen as a threat, unfortunately, not without some just cause by some farmers who see trees as a threat to their farming business rather than as an asset. So I think that's the big challenge as we move from the really first adopters and potentially, I think we're maybe onto the early second adopters, but as we move through to the mainstream of farmers, I think that's the challenge, is how do we convince them that actually for most of them it would be advantageous, and it's not a kind of it's not have trees and lose the farming, which sadly a lot of farmers do still think. So
Thanks. Are there any final questions before we wrap the session up for this evening? Well, in that case, as we draw towards 8 o'clock, can I just, on everyone's behalf, thank you, Ben, so much for coming and talking so eruditely and passionately all about silvohorticulture. There's so much to take away and reflect on and research in. And thank you for giving up your time this evening for us. And yes, we look forward to seeing what you do next. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure, Kat, and apologies again for keeping you waiting at the start.
Not at all. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.